The Mexican-American War was a conflict between the United States and Mexico, sparked by the U.S. annexation of Texas in 1845, hoping to seize even more territory from Mexico. U.S. President James K. Polk used the Texas dispute to provoke a war, precipitating the U.S. invasions of California, New Mexico, and the Mexican heartland. After the fall of Mexico City in September 1847, the Mexican government relinquished 529,000 square miles of territory to the U.S. in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The war has often been regarded as an unjust invasion, both by contemporaries and later historians, and would only inflame the sectional divisions in the U.S. that would lead to the American Civil War. In 1821, after over a decade of perpetual conflict, the Mexican War of Independence came to an end. For Mexico, the cost of winning independence from Spain came not only in blood, but also in coin. As the once prosperous colony found its economy in tatters, money barely circulated. The silver mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato had been devastated, and throughout the country, ranches and farms stood deserted. The idea also gained momentum in the U.S., where Southern Democrats, who wished to expand the institution of slavery, relished the idea of adding another slave state to the Union, while other Americans believed Texas annexation would be a huge step toward the manifest destiny of their nation to spread its influence across the continent. Promising to guide the U.S. to its manifest destiny on the coasts of the Pacific, he was interested not only in acquiring Texas, but also New Mexico and California. In November 1845, he dispatched a secret representative, Johns, to Mexico City with an offer to buy the Rio Grande border, New Mexico, and Alta California, all for $25 million. Once Slidell's purpose became known, however, his very presence in Mexico City was perceived as an insult. Negotiations were further hampered by the instability of the Mexican government. In 1846 alone, the Mexican presidency exchanged hands 4 times. Frustrated that he was getting nowhere with the negotiations, Slidell reported back to Washington that a war will probably be the best mode of settling our affairs with Mexico. But Polk was way ahead of him. Having anticipated that the negotiations would fail, he had spent the last few months positioning his armies to provoke a war with Mexico and seize the lands he desired by force. After some hiccups, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution offering annexation to Texas in February 1845. Texas accepted and, in December, became the 28th state. This, of course, was seen as a hostile act by Mexico, who had yet to recognize Texas' independence, let alone its annexation to the U.S. Nor did Mexico agree with Texas' assertion that the Rio Grande constituted its southern boundary. Historically, the border of Mexican Texas had ended at the Nueces River, 150 miles north of the line Texas now claimed. But the newly elected U.S. President, James K. Polk, did not care what Mexico thought. I regard the question of annexation as belonging exclusively to the United States and Texas, he proclaimed in his inaugural address. To revitalize its economy and protect its vulnerable northern territories from Comanche and Apache raids, Mexico decided to invite Anglo-American settlers into Texas to exploit the region's untapped resources. Thousands of Anglo-Americans flooded into Texas, many of them bringing slaves, so that, by 1830, the U.S. transplants outnumbered the Hispanic Tejanos by more than 2 to 1. Eventually, relations between these Anglo-American settlers and the Mexican government deteriorated, especially after Mexico abolished slavery. In October 1835, the settlers, who called themselves Texians, rebelled, sparking the Texas Revolution. Initially, the Mexican army, under Antonio de Santa Anna, got the better of the rebels. scoring a victory at the Battle of the Alamo and butchering 400 Texian prisoners at the Goliad massacre, but the tide abruptly turned at the Battle of San Jacinto when Texian forces under Gen. Sam Houston surprised and defeated the Mexican army. Santa Anna was taken captive and forced to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence. But since the treaty was signed under duress, Santa Anna likely would have been executed had he not signed. It was not ratified by the Mexican Congress, which refused to recognize Texian independence. Thus, for the next several years, periodic fighting erupted across the Mexico-Texas border as Texas began to operate like an independent republic. These events were closely watched by the United States. Since 1803, the U.S. had claimed Texas, believing it to have been a rightful part of the Louisiana Purchase. Spain, however, had denied this claim and resisted every U.S. attempt to buy the territory. Now, the U.S. saw its opportunity, and in 1843, President John Tyler quietly opened talks to annex Texas. While some Texians preferred to remain independent, others saw the benefit of joining the United States. A Democrat in the mold of Andrew Jackson, Polk had run on a platform of expansionism. On the 15th of June, 1845, before he sent Slidell to negotiate, Polk ordered Brig. Gen. Zachary Taylor into Texas with orders to approach as near the Rio Grande as prudence will dictate. All right, now let's go through the events of the Mexican War, one day at a time. It is unclear who fired first, but the skirmish results in 4 American casualties, including 1 officer, and between 15 and 20 Mexican casualties. News of the fight reaches Washington, D.C., and a congressional committee begins drafting a declaration of war. Day 1, 1846. American and Mexican troops exchange shots along the Rio Grande. The amendment to the declaration of war would prohibit slavery from any territory acquired from Mexico. The President proclaims to Congress that the attack on Thornton S. Troop was a hostile and unprovoked act of the Mexican government. The following day, Taylor issues a proclamation announcing that although hostilities had commenced, he intended to treat the Mexican people as friends and not to commit any act of cruelty or violence. He therefore considered Paredes' government illegitimate and that all previous peaceful means of settling the dispute with Mexico exhausted. Southerners immediately oppose it as an infringement upon their right to take enslaved people into new territories. Day 2, 1846. U.S. Representative David Wilmot introduces the Wilmot Proviso to the House of Representatives. He also informs Congress that Major General Winfield Scott has landed in Mexico with 6,000 troops, and that Commodore Thomas A.P.C. Upser has occupied the port of Veracruz. A few weeks earlier, Polk had dispatched a naval squadron to blockade Mexican ports. Upon arrival, American sailors found the city unguarded and quickly raised the American flag over the custom house. Day 3, 1846. At the request of Polk, Congress declares that the U.S. is in a state of war with Mexico. Day 4, 1846. General Zachary Taylor and his 4,000-man army occupy the city of Mexico. Day 5, 1846. The U.S. Navy captures the port of Tampico. Here, Polk establishes his first military headquarters of the war. During the battle, the Americans use a tactic called a flying artillery, which allows them to effectively counter the Mexican cavalry. They find the city fortified and well defended by the Mexican army. The victory enables Taylor's army to advance south along the Rio Grande. Day 6, 1846. The U.S. ship Lexington shells and captures the port of Tuxpan, Mexico. The decisive victory enables Taylor to push the Mexicans back across the Rio Grande, securing American possession of northern Mexico. Taylor renames Fort Texas Fort Brown in honor of the fort's slain commander. Day 7, 1846. American naval forces capture the island of Anahuac off the coast of Mexico. Day 8, 1846. American troops, under the command of General Zachary Taylor, defeat the Mexican army in the Battle of Palo Alto. Day 9, 1846. American troops under the command of General Zachary Taylor defeat the Mexican army in the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. Day 10, 1846. President James K. Polk announces to Congress that the United States has been victorious in 2 engagements along the Rio Grande. Day 11, 1846. American forces land in the port of Veracruz, Mexico. Day 12, 1846. American troops begin their march from Veracruz to the capital, Mexico City. Day 13, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Cordoba, Mexico. Day 14, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Orizaba, Mexico. Polk establishes his second military headquarters here. Day 15, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Puebla, Mexico. Day 16, 1846. American troops continue their advance towards Mexico City. As mentioned previously, this group was mostly made up of Whigs, although there were a few Democrats who also opposed the war. For example, former President Martin Van Buren ran on an anti-war platform against Polk in the 1844 election. Unfortunately for Van Buren, his efforts were unsuccessful and Polk won the presidency by a landslide. Anti-war feelings were particularly strong in the North, where many people felt that the war was being fought simply to acquire more land for slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, which attempted to ban slavery in any territory gained from Mexico, was a major point of contention in the run-up to the war. However, once hostilities began, anti-slavery advocates realized that the best way to stop the expansion of slavery was to keep the territories free by popular sovereignty. This meant that the decision of whether or not to allow slavery in each territory would be put to a vote of the people living there. This strategy was codified in the Free Soil Party, which was founded in 1848 by former abolitionists. The Free Soil Party nominated former President Martin Van Buren for president. Their main platform was to keep the United States free from slavery. Although the Free Soil Party was ultimately unsuccessful, its influence did play a role in shaping the future of the country. The party's focus on popular sovereignty as a means of keeping slavery out of new territories would become a major factor in the debate over slavery in the years to come. Day 17, 1846. American troops reach the city of Mexico. Day 18, 1846. American troops force their way past Mexican defenses into the city of Mexico. Day 19, 1846. American troops continue their advance into Mexico City. Day 20, 1846. American troops enter the city of Mexico. Day 21, 1846. American troops occupy the National Palace in Mexico City. Day 22, 1846. American troops occupy the city of Guadalajara. Day 23, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Monterrey, Mexico. Day 24, 1846. American troops engage in a running battle with Mexican troops outside of the city of Monterrey. Day 25, 1846. American troops enter the city of Monterrey. Day 26, 1846. American troops engage in heavy fighting with Mexican troops inside the city of Monterrey. Day 27, 1846. American troops capture the city of Day 28, 1846. American troops march from Monterrey to Day 29, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Day 30, 1846. American troops engage in heavy fighting with Mexican troops at the Battle of Santa Ana. Day 31, 1846. American troops defeat Mexican troops at the Battle of Santa Ana. Now we re-gone. Now, take a break from the fighting to talk about some of the home front developments during the Mexican War. Although the war with Mexico was extremely popular in the United States, there was still a large group of people who were strongly opposed to it. Alright, now let's get back to the fighting. Day 32, 1846. American troops march from Saltillo to Chihuahua. Day 33, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Chihuahua. Day 34, 1846. American troops begin their advance on the city of Peril. Day 35, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Peril. Day 36, 1846. American troops engage in heavy fighting with Mexican troops at the Battle of Sacramento. Day 37, 1846. American troops defeat Mexican troops at the Battle of Sacramento. Day 38, 1846. American troops continue their advance on Peril. Day 39, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Peril. Day 40, 1846. American troops occupy the city of Peril. Day 41, 1846. American troops march from Peril to Durango. Day 42, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Durango. Day 43, 1846. American troops engage in heavy fighting with Mexican troops at the Battle of Durango. Day 44, 1846. American troops defeat Mexican troops at the Battle of Durango. Day 45, 1846. American troops continue their advance on Durango. Day 46, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Durango. Day 47, 1846. American troops occupy the city of Durango. Day 48, 1846. American troops march from Durango to Day 49, 1846. American troops arrive at the city of Day 50, 1846. American troops engage in heavy fighting with Mexican troops at the Battle of Day 51, 1846. American troops defeat Mexican troops at the Battle of And that's the end of Part 4. If you want to see Part 5, then click here. Polk's plan, of course, required the rapid seizure of both New Mexico and Alta California. As early as June 1845, U.S. Commodore John D. Sloat of the Pacific Squadron was ordered to occupy San Francisco as soon as he learned that war had broken out. Likewise, Capt. John C. led a military expedition overland to the Oregon Territory so that he could be ready to strike when the time came. His arrival in May 1846 emboldened the small number of American pioneers who had settled in Alta California to rebel against Mexican authorities. On the 14th of June, 30 American settlers seized the town of Sonoma and raised their flag, depicting a crudely drawn bear. Immediately moved in to support the rebels and help them beat back the Mexican militia. They declared independence, establishing the short-lived California Republic. When Sloat arrived in San Francisco on the 9th of July, he proclaimed the permanent annexation of California to the United States. The bear flag that had flown over Sonoma was lowered, replaced with the stars and stripes. Meanwhile, U.S. Brig. Gen. Stephen Watts Kearny marched from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, at the head of the 1,700-man Army of the West, tasked with the capture of New Mexico. Kearny entered Santa Fe unopposed on the 15th of August. The Mexican governor, Manuel Armijo, had disbanded his militia and fled to Chihuahua. Perhaps, after accepting a bribe, Kearny stayed long enough to set up a provisional government before pressing on to aid in the conquest of Alta California. On the 17th of January, 1847, Pueblos and Mexicans joined together and rebelled against the U.S. occupation of New Mexico in the Taos Revolt. The insurrectionists killed many of the occupying Americans, including the provisional governor Charles Bent, whose scalp was paraded through the streets. The revolt was ultimately put down, and 16 insurrectionists were hanged as traitors. Despite the Secretary of War's ruling that they had never sworn allegiance to the U.S. and could not be guilty of treason, Kearny's main army, meanwhile, arrived in Alta California in November 1846, where the local Californios had also revolted against U.S. occupation. Kearny joined forces with U.S. Commodore Robert F. Stockton to defeat the Californiols at the Battle of San Gabriel. A few days later, a regional peace treaty was signed at Cahuenga. Thus, by early 1847, both New Mexico and California were under U.S. control. After his initial victories around Fort Brown, Taylor led his army across the Rio Grande. He seized first Matamoros and then Camargo, where his army spent an agonizing 6 weeks baking in the scorching summer sun. The resultant Battle of Monterrey was long and hard-fought, devolving into bloody urban combat as U.S. and Mexican troops struggled over every street. His administration had been in contact with Santa Anna, who had been living in disgrace and political exile in Cuba. After the former Mexican leader assured the Americans that he would make peace, Polk helped Santa Anna return to Mexico, where he swiftly regained the presidency. But Santa Anna had played Polk for a fool. No sooner had he seized power in Mexico City than he put together an army of 20,000 men and rushed to attack Taylor's weakened army. The ensuing Battle of Buena Vista was the largest battle of the war. Though the Americans were outnumbered, they commanded excellent defensive ground and were able to withstand wave after wave of Mexican assault. In the end, both armies claimed victory. The Americans, because they retained control of the battlefield, the Mexicans because they took several flags, cannons, and prisoners of war. Although he initially wanted to renew the fight, Santa Anna was persuaded by his officers to retreat to San Luis Potosí, which he did on the frosty evening of the 23rd of February. In the wake of his retreating army, hundreds of wounded Mexican soldiers were abandoned to die. On the 4th day of fighting, the two sides agreed to an armistice, where Taylor would allow the Mexican army to evacuate Monterrey in exchange for the city's surrender. While this was certainly prudent, President Polk was outraged when he learned of the armistice. Believing that Taylor had missed his chance to destroy the Mexican army, Polk decided to strip Taylor's army of its veteran troops, sending them to another army, preparing for an assault on Veracruz. Taylor's army was comprised mainly of untrained volunteers, who did not possess the life-saving sanitation habits of the regular soldiers. Consequently, diseases like dysentery were rampant, carrying off 1 in 8 men. As Lt. George B. McClellan observed, the volunteers literally die like dogs. Desertion, too, was endemic, with hundreds of troops fleeing or even enough Irish-American immigrants went over to the Mexican army to form their own battalion. The celebrated After his long stay at Taylor marched his 6,000 able-bodied troops to the strategic city of Monterrey, defended by 7,000 Mexican soldiers and 3,000 irregular troops. This was not the first time Polk had meddled in the war. On the 9th of March, 1847, only 2 weeks after Buena Vista, a second front was opened when a convoy of over 100 American ships dropped off 10,000 soldiers 3 miles south of the port city of Veracruz. This army was commanded by Gen. Winfield Scott, a hero of the War of 1812 and the U.S. Army's senior general. He wasted no time launching an artillery bombardment of Veracruz. Outmatched by the superior American artillery, the city fell on the 26th of March. The talks broke down, however, and hostilities resumed on the 6th of September. Santa Anna, hoping to rouse the populace in defense of the capital, urged his people to preserve your altars from infamous violation, and your daughters and your wives from the extremity of insult. On the 8th of September, the Americans raided a flour mill called Molina del Rey, after receiving faulty reports that the Mexicans were casting cannonballs there. The Battle of Molina del Rey turned into a major battle and cost the Americans 800 casualties. On the 13th of September, the Americans won the Battle of Chapultepec, seizing a vital Mexican stronghold. After these bloody battles reduced the Mexican defenses, Scott's troops entered Mexico City on the 14th of September 1847. Santa Anna resigned the presidency on the 16th of September, and the Mexican government set up a provisional capital at The war was all but over. While guerrilla fighters continued harassing U.S. forces, the Mexican army no longer possessed the capacity to fight. The question was whether peace could be negotiated before the Mexican government collapsed and the country devolved into anarchy. Scott did not linger but began his march toward Mexico City, following the same route that and his conquistadors took 3 centuries before. Santa Anna marshaled another army to oppose him, and the opposing forces clashed at the Battle of Saragossa. Once again aided by their artillery, the Americans outmaneuvered the Mexican army, which broke and fled. Continuing his advance, Scott took the city of Puebla, where he waited 6 weeks for reinforcements. Since Mexican guerrilla fighters were harassing his supply lines, he made the decision to cut himself off from his base of operations and live off the land. He marched through the mountain passes on the 7th of August and defeated another large Mexican army at the Battle of To cover their retreat after the battle, the Mexicans left some soldiers in the monastery of San Mateo, protecting the bridge over the Rio. Scott ordered the monastery taken, leading to the bloody Battle of Churubusco. Wave after wave of American assault was repulsed, and the monastery's defenders surrendered only after running out of ammunition. Among the defenders were the San Patricios, who had made their last stand knowing the fate that awaited them should they be captured. Indeed, 50 of the Irish defectors were executed after falling back into American hands. At this point, Scott could have entered Mexico City but chose not to, believing that his starving troops would pillage and burn. Instead, he opened negotiations for a truce. Scott's successful invasion, as well as the swift conquests of New Mexico and Alta California, left Polk with a sense of total victory. Hungry for more land, he began making plans to acquire additional Mexican territory, such as Baja California, with some Democrats even calling for the annexation of all Mexico. But a wrench was thrown into Polk's imperialist plans by Nicholas Trist, the American negotiator embedded within Scott's army. Trist wanted to make a treaty that could realistically end the war, and he knew that the Mexican Congress would never accept Polk's new demands. Additionally, Trist was ashamed by his country's conduct in the war and refused to ask for more land than he had to. In November 1847, Trist was recalled by the Polk administration. However, he ignored these orders, fearing that the window to negotiate was quickly closing. On the 2nd of February 1848, Trist and the Mexican commissioners signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded Alta California, New Mexico, and Texas to the U.S. in exchange for $15 million. The U.S. Congress, eager to end the war, ratified the treaty. Though the imperialist Polk was disappointed, he had gotten everything he initially hoped for, and he left office having expanded the territory of the U.S. more than any other president. But for the U.S., the true price of this wicked war, as Ulysses S. Grant would call it, was yet to be fully realized. Debate over whether slavery should expand into the so-called Mexican Cession would inflame the sectional crisis between North and South that would lead to the American Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, or the American War of Independence. was a conflict between Great Britain and its 13 North American colonies, who declared independence as the United States of America, initially a rebellion within the British Empire. The war took on a global scope, when France and Spain joined against the British, contributing to the eventual American victory. The war was the central part of a broader political upheaval, the American Revolution, which had taken root over a decade before the first shots were fired. The quarrel between Britain and the 13 colonies over the issue of parliamentary taxes steadily escalated as colonists were divided into factions. The Whigs, or patriots, opposed the taxes on the basis that they were unconstitutional, while the Tories, or loyalists, remained in support of Great Britain. Despite Gage's attempts at discretion, the patriots had discovered his intentions several days in advance. No sooner had the British troops set out than two patriot riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, were on their way to alert the militia. After discovering that most of the munitions had already been removed by the patriots, the soldiers began their 12-mile retreat to Boston. The patriots harassed them, utilizing guerrilla warfare, and by the end of the march, they had lost 273 casualties, compared to 95 Patriot losses. By then, the number of Patriots had swollen to 15,000 men. Encouraged by their victory in the battles of Lexington and the Patriots laid siege to the 6,000 soldiers trapped inside Boston. When the British soldiers reached the town of Lexington, on the road to Concord, they were confronted by 70 militiamen. After a brief standoff, a shot was fired. Although it is unknown who fired it, it became immortalized as the shot heard round the world. The British forces responded by firing 2 musket volleys, killing 8 militiamen and wounding another 10. Tensions sometimes boiled over into acts of violence, such as the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. A group of political agitators known as the Sons of Liberty was also known to assault loyalists, tarring and feathering them. In 1774, Parliament responded to the Boston Tea Party by issuing the so-called Intolerable Acts, which aimed to punish Boston by closing its harbor to commerce and suspending representative government in mass. In September 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress, where it was decided that the New England militias should begin preparing for a potential conflict with British soldiers. Amidst these rising tensions, General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, knew that he could not crush a rebellion with the meager forces he had on hand, and sought to suppress the New England militias before they had a chance to strike. He decided to achieve this by seizing stores of munitions that the militias had kept stockpiled in various towns. Shortly after midnight, on the 19th of April 1775, 700 elite British soldiers marched toward the town of where one such stockpile of weapons was stored. After clearing the colonial militia off Lexington Green, the British continued on to where they encountered more resistance from 400 militiamen. Despite their numerical advantage, the Patriots lacked enough arms and ammunition to win the siege. Hoping to steal the artillery they needed from Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, the Patriots dispatched an expedition jointly led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold to take the fort. On the 10th of May, 1775, Allen and Arnold took the garrison by surprise and secured the capture of Fort Ticonderoga without spilling a drop of blood. Meanwhile, the Patriots outside Boston decided to lure the British Army into an engagement by fortifying the provocative position atop Breeders' Hill. The British had no choice but to launch a frontal assault. Although the ensuing Battle of Bunker Hill was a British victory, it came at the horrendous price of 1,054 casualties. By this point, the Second Continental Congress had taken on the role of wartime government of the rebellious colonies. It had adopted the New England Army, which was now referred to as the Continental Army, and appointed George Washington to lead it. Washington arrived outside Boston, in July 1775 and immediately set about strengthening discipline and reinforcing the military hierarchy. In autumn, he sent Colonel Henry Knox to retrieve the artillery from Ticonderoga. Arriving in November, Knox loaded the cannons onto 42 sleds and hauled them the hundreds of miles back to Boston. Washington positioned the guns on the heights overlooking the city. Rather than endure such a bombardment, the British forces evacuated Boston on the 17th of March, 1776. Emboldened by the Patriot performance in the Siege of Boston, Congress authorized the American invasion of Quebec, a British colony in Canada, hoping to coerce it into joining the rebellion. The Patriots captured Montreal and laid siege to the city of Quebec, but suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Quebec, where their commander, General Richard Montgomery, was killed, demoralized and riddled with smallpox. The Patriots maintained a half-hearted siege of the city until the arrival of British reinforcements compelled them to withdraw. Washington was quick to act. On Christmas Day, 1776, he led his army back across the Delaware River, surprising and defeating a Hessian garrison at the Battle of Trenton the next morning. He followed this up with a victory over the British rearguard at the Battle of Princeton. These victories galvanized renewed support for the Revolution and staved off defeat for at least another campaign season. In April 1776, Washington moved his army to New York City, predicting that its economic significance and strategic location would make it the next target of a British attack. He was right. In July, just as the United States was declaring its independence, British General William Howe arrived in New York Harbor with an army of 32,000 men, including British regulars as well as German auxiliary troops, commonly known as Hesse. On the 22nd of August, Howe landed on Long Island and assaulted the American defenses atop Brooklyn Heights. 5 days later, the Battle of Long Island resulted in another American defeat and the loss of 2,000 Continental troops. Washington was forced to evacuate New York City, which came under British occupation on the 15th of September. Howe pursued Washington, fighting a string of battles at Harlem Heights, White Plains, and Fort Washington. The Continental Army was chased out of Manhattan, through New Jersey, and across the Delaware River. By December, its strength had dwindled to barely 3,000 ragged, disease-ridden men. Washington knew that the success of the revolution depended on the survival of his army, and so he adopted a Fabian strategy. He would avoid pitched battles, striking only when an opportunity presented itself. Despite being on the cusp of victory, the British soldiers entered winter quarters, believing that the Continental Army were too weak to pose a threat. Despite the setbacks at Trenton and Princeton, the new year of 1777 found the British confident of victory. Indeed, Tories in New York City referred to it as the year of the hangman, as the 777s seemed to resemble the gallows from which the Patriots would soon swing. But as he penetrated deeper into the wilderness of upstate New York, he found that his supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. He defeated Washington twice, at the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown, but was unable to land a killing blow, and clothing. Around 2,000 soldiers died during the next 6 months from exposure, malnutrition, and disease. The army was saved when Washington garnered enough congressional support to reorganize the faulty supply department. The Continentals also underwent significant retraining at Valley Forge. Under the careful guidance of professional soldiers like Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, he then occupied Philadelphia but failed to capture the Continental Congress, which had prudently evacuated the city. Although Howe had achieved his goal, the capture of Philadelphia did not have the desired effect, as the Patriot movement seemed no closer to collapsing. Frustrated, Howe blamed his lack of success on inadequate support from Parliament and resigned. He sent a detachment of Germans to forage for supplies, only for the entire force to be wiped out by Patriot militia at Bennington. Still, Burgoyne's pride prevented him from turning back. He crossed over to the west side of the Hudson, only to come face to face with the Northern Department of the Continental Army near Saratoga, New York. Burgoyne fought the Patriots in 2 engagements, collectively known as the Battles of Saratoga, but was defeated both times. On the 17th of October, with no sign of help from Manhattan, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, marking the greatest Patriot victory of the war thus far. The British War Minister, Lord Germain, had ordered General John Burgoyne to push south from Canada and advance along the Hudson River to capture Albany, New York, a move that would isolate New England from the other colonies. Germain expected General Howe to push northwards from Manhattan in support. Although he offered vague promises of assistance, Howe had no intention of playing second fiddle to Burgoyne. Instead, he planned his own campaign to capture the U.S. capital of Philadelphia, a move that he believed would win the war. Burgoyne's offensive, which began on the 20th of June, recaptured Fort Ticonderoga and defeated a Patriot force at Hubbard. As Burgoyne was struggling in New York, Howe began his Philadelphia campaign, landing in Maryland in late August. Meanwhile, the Continental Army had moved into winter quarters at Valley Forge, where it suffered from a lack of supplies, including food. Since the outbreak of hostilities, France had been watching the war with interest, eager to avenge its humiliating defeat in the recent 7 Years' War. France had been supplying the rebellious colonies with weapons and supplies. French officers, too, had been commissioned as major generals in the Continental Army, including the famous Marquis. The Saratoga campaign convinced the French Foreign Minister, Comte de Vergennes, that the U.S. stood a chance at victory. In early 1778, Vergennes negotiated an alliance with the United States, and France officially entered the war, dispatching a fleet to North America in April. In 1779, Spain entered the war as well, but only as a French ally. The Spanish wanted to weaken Britain, but did not want to acknowledge the independence of the United States, fearing the effect it would have on their own colonies. The Dutch Republic, too, helped finance the revolution and went to war with Britain in 1780. The entry of these European powers transformed a small localized rebellion into a global conflict, stretching Britain's military forces thin. Battles took place in the Caribbean, India, and even in Europe, where a French army conducted the Great Siege of Gibraltar. In May 1778, the British Army evacuated Philadelphia. Howe's replacement, Sir Henry Clinton, had been ordered to consolidate his forces in New York City to brace for a possible French attack there. The French Admiral Comte d'Estaing agreed to help the American General John Sullivan assault the British-occupied city of Newport, Rhode Island. Rapid depreciation of the continental currency meant that Congress could not pay the soldiers what they were owed, leading several continental regiments to mutiny in early 1781. Hoping to capitalize on the tensions in the Continental Army, German General Wilhelm von Nefersen launched an attack on New Jersey, but was repulsed at the battles of Connecticut Farms and Springfield. In September 1780, the capture of British Major John revealed that Benedict Arnold had become disillusioned with the Patriot cause and had plotted to sell the stronghold of West Point to the British Army. Arnold escaped capture and defected to the British side, while his contact, Major, was hanged as a spy. However, after the French ships were battered in a storm, d'Estaing opted to sail for Boston for repairs, leaving Sullivan's army on its own at the Battle of Rhode Island. The next year saw limited action in the north. Although the Americans did capture key British positions at Stony Point and Paulus Hook, Washington took advantage of the quiet to send General Sullivan on a punitive expedition against those Iroquois nations that had allied with the British. Sullivan's expedition destroyed over 40 Iroquois villages in upstate New York and burned over 160,000 bushels of corn, greatly reducing the political power of the Iroquois Confederacy. Washington pursued, striking at the Battle of Monmouth, which greatly raised Patriot morale, as the Continentals held their ground for 5 hours in the scorching heat. The British Army then withdrew to the safety of New York City, with the Continental Army taking up a position just outside the city. The two armies would maintain these approximate positions for the next 3 years. In the summer of 1778, the French fleet arrived off the American coastline. The Continental Army spent the winter of 1779–80 at Morris, New Jersey, where it experienced an even harsher winter than at Valley Forge. As fighting petered out in the north, the British generals shifted their focus to the American South, partially because the South was rumored to be replete with loyalists who would welcome the British Army with open arms. Another reason was that the South provided the U.S. with much of its cash crops, including rice, indigo. Although Cornwallis won a major victory over a hastily assembled American army at the Battle of Camden, the residents of South Carolina proved much less loyalist than he would have liked. Several patriot militias began springing up in the Carolinian backcountry, led by cunning men like Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, and Andrew Pickens, utilizing their knowledge of the land. These militias would strike at parties of British soldiers before melting back into the woodlands and swamps. Cornwallis attempted to beat the Patriots at their own game by raising Tory militias, sparking a bloody South Carolinian civil war. But the strength of these Tory militias was broken at the Battle of Kings Mountain and Tobacco, the loss of which would be a major blow to the American war effort. In December 1778, as part of their southern strategy, the British Army captured the lightly defended Savannah, Georgia. The following year, a Franco-American army failed to retake the city at the Siege of Savannah, making Georgia the first state to fall back under British control. Emboldened by this success, General Clinton launched a larger expedition against Charleston, South Carolina, the most important city in the South. The Siege of Charleston was arguably the greatest British victory of the war. Clinton not only captured Charleston itself, but took prisoner the entire southern department of the Continental Army. Satisfied with his victory, Clinton returned to Manhattan, leaving his second-in-command, Lord Charles Cornwallis, behind to pacify the rest of South Carolina. This proved easier said than done. After the British suffered another defeat at the Battle of Cowpens, a frustrated Cornwallis decided to march into North Carolina to deal with the Continental Army under General Nathanael Greene, which was providing aid to the South Carolina militia. Cornwallis caught up with Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, winning a Pyrrhic victory. Greene, following Washington's example, managed to slip away with his army intact, depriving Cornwallis of a decisive victory. Rather than chase Greene across the Carolinas, Cornwallis decided to press on into Virginia, hoping that his suppression of that state would end Patriot resistance throughout the South. Greene, meanwhile, confronted the forces Cornwallis had left behind in the Carolinas, fighting battles at Hobkirk's Hill and Eutaw Springs. As soon as Cornwallis invaded Virginia, he was reprimanded by General Clinton. Under the false impression that Washington was preparing to attack New York City, Clinton ordered Cornwallis to return to Manhattan. The exasperated Cornwallis marched his army to the port town of Yorktown, fortifying it as he awaited the Royal Navy to pick him up. Parliament had, by now, grown war-weary. The Ministry of Lord North, which had conducted the war, was ousted, and the new ministry offered to negotiate peace. The resultant Treaty of Paris of 1783 brought an end to the war. Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States, whose borders were fixed at the Mississippi River. Washington and the new British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Guy Carleton, negotiated a ceasefire as the peace negotiations were underway, and the last British troops evacuated New York City in November 1783. The war was finally over, leaving the infant United States to figure out what kind of nation it was going to become. The Patriots sensed a perfect opportunity. A small force under Marquis de Lafayette was sent to keep Cornwallis trapped in Yorktown, while Washington led a combined Franco-American force south. Meanwhile, a French fleet under Comte de Gras defeated a British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis' escape by sea. Washington's Allied army commenced a siege of Yorktown, which ended with Cornwallis' surrender on the 19th of October 1781. With the American victory at York, the active phase of the war came to an end. The American invasion of Quebec was a military campaign undertaken during the American Revolutionary War. Hoping to induce the province of Quebec to join the rebellion, the Second Continental Congress dispatched troops under Generals Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold to occupy British-controlled Canada. It was a two-pronged invasion. A 1,200-man colonial force under General Montgomery left Fort Ticonderoga in September 1775, going on to capture Fort Saint-Jean and occupy Montreal. As the siege wore on, Canadian loyalists were able to turn public opinion against the American invaders, leading to unrest in American-occupied Montreal. In May 1776, fresh British troops and Hessian mercenaries under General John Burgoyne arrived in Canada, emboldening Canadian Governor Guy Carleton to launch a counter-offensive. As a result, the disease-ridden Continental Army broke off its siege and withdrew to Fort Ticonderoga. The American defeat ended all hopes of Canada joining the American Revolution, and opened a path for General Burgoyne to launch his Saratoga campaign through New York's Hudson Valley the following year. A second 1,100-man expedition, led by General Arnold, departed from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and arrived at the city of Quebec by way of Maine. Here, Arnold's force linked up with and the Americans launched an assault on Quebec City on the 31st of December 1775. The battle went disastrously for the Americans. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and the American attack was repulsed. The invasion climaxed with an American defeat at the Battle of Quebec. The invasion marked the first offensive campaign conducted by the American Continental Army, which occurred despite the Continental Congress' insistence that it was fighting a purely defensive war. After the Battle of Quebec, the Americans maintained a half-hearted siege of the city, during which time their army was ravaged by smallpox. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, the province of Quebec was still a relatively new addition to the British Empire, concentrated along the St. Lawrence River Valley and extending beyond the Great Lakes to the banks of the Ohio River. The province of Quebec had been under French control until the French and Indian War, and extended the borders of the province of Quebec into the Ohio River Valley. As the colonists began to lay siege to the British forces holed up in Boston, another group of colonial militiamen under Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Even as the Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to London in a last-ditch effort to negotiate a peace, it began to prepare for a protracted conflict, organizing the Continental Army under the command of General George Washington. Some congressional delegates also began to reconsider an invasion of Quebec, especially once it became known that General Guy Carleton, the British governor of Quebec, was strengthening Canadian fortifications and was actively using Canada as a base from which to court the Iroquois Confederacy into siding with the British. In late June 1775, the Congress gave General Philip Schuyler permission to begin planning a Canadian invasion, should an opportunity arise. The hope was that an American invasion would convince Canadian patriots to rise against the British and join the American cause as the 14th colony. In their report to the Second Continental Congress, Arnold and Allen noted that the province of Quebec was poorly defended by only militia forces and could be occupied by an American army as small as 1,200 men. Both Arnold and Allen requested the honor of leading such a campaign, but the idea was initially dismissed by the Continental Congress, who did not want to appear to be the aggressors in the conflict. Both of these provisions offended the American colonists. The overwhelmingly Protestant Americans feared the encroachment of Catholicism into their lands, while Virginian land surveyors felt cheated out of the Ohio Territory, which they felt rightly belonged to them. Yet, at the same time, conflict was mounting between the 13 colonies and the British Parliament, and by autumn, many believed war was inevitable. Despite the generational hatred between the French Canadians and Americans, the First Continental Congress recognized the value of Canadian support and formally invited the province of Quebec to join the struggle against British tyranny. The Congress received no answer. When the city of Quebec was captured by the British after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, when the Treaty of Paris ended that war in 1763, France officially ceded its Canadian territory to Britain. The Canadians were now subjects to the British Crown, as were the American colonists of the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. However, the French and Indian Wars had pitted the Canadians and Americans against one another for nearly a century, and those years of bloody warfare were not equally forgotten. The American colonists distrusted their French-speaking Catholic neighbors to the north. In 1774, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which protected the Canadians' right to practice Catholicism. On the 19th of April, 1775, tensions boiled over when the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired in Massachusetts at the battles of Lexington and Concord, which resulted in an American victory. In the meantime, the war continued to escalate. The Battle of Bunker Hill resulted in horrendous British casualties and greatly reduced the chance for a peaceful compromise. General Schuyler immediately began assembling an expedition at Fort Tice. By August, Schuyler had amassed some 1,200 men, including Ethan Allen and his famous militia, the Green Mountain Boys. Just before the invasion was to begin, however, Schuyler fell ill and handed the command of the expedition off to Major General Richard Montgomery. British General Carleton could do little to impede its progress. Men were deserting from his militias at an alarming rate, and he lacked any British regular soldiers. On the 3rd of November, the fort finally fell to Montgomery's troops. Upon hearing the news, Carleton fled to Quebec City, believing Montreal to be indefensible. Therefore, Montgomery occupied Montreal on the 13th of November without a fight. Montgomery lingered in Montreal for several days, during which time he published pamphlets in support of the American cause and met with leading American sympathizers to discuss the election of Canadian delegates to the Continental Congress. While in Montreal, the enlistments of many American troops expired, leaving Montgomery with only 500 men. However, emboldened by his recent success, Montgomery decided to push on to Quebec City anyway. Despite his depleted force, he took 300 men with him and left Major General David Wooster and 200 troops behind to garrison Montreal. An Irish-born veteran of the French and Indian War, Montgomery had resigned from the British Army in 1772 before settling in New York, where he married into a family of ardent American patriots. Montgomery was quick to identify as an American and adopt his wife's anti-British beliefs. His political ideology and military experience made him the ideal candidate to lead the attack on Quebec. General Montgomery led the colonial force out of Ticonderoga on the 25th of August 1775, where they followed the Richelieu River to Fort St-Jean, arriving on the 6th of September. Fort St-Jean sat at the north end of Lake Champlain and guarded the entry into the province of Quebec. For the next several days, the colonial troops engaged in skirmishes on the outskirts of the fort, in which they battled against Britain's indigenous allies, the bulk of which were comprised of On the 17th of September, Montgomery officially laid siege to the fort, hoping to test the theory that the French Canadians would rush to the Americans' aid. Montgomery sent Allen and the Green Mountain Boys to recruit a new militia from the Canadians. Allen, however, had more ambitious plans in mind. Believing Montreal to be likely defeated, he attempted to capture the city on the 25th of September, but was defeated at the Battle of Long Point and taken prisoner. Despite this small setback, the siege of Fort Saint-Chang continued with relative ease. As Montgomery pushed on toward Quebec City, a second American expedition was headed for the same destination. Benedict Arnold yearned for more of the glory that he had tasted when he had captured Fort Ticonderoga and asked General Washington for permission to lead a secondary expedition into Canada in support of Montgomery. Washington consented and gave Arnold 1,100 men for the expedition, including Daniel Morgan and his company of rifles. Setting sail from Newburyport, Arnold's expedition arrived at the mouth of the Quebec River in what is today the state of Maine on the 19th of September 1775. The plan was to reach Quebec City by following the rivers of Maine. Yet Arnold seems to have underestimated the amount of ground he and his troops would need to travel across. The boats that the men used to travel up the Kennebec were leaky, leading to the spoiling of gunpowder and provisions. The men were nevertheless in good spirits when it came time to exit the Kennebec and carry the 400-pound boats across the Maine wilderness to reach the river. However, a combination of abysmal weather and swampy terrain quickly destroyed morale, especially when provisions began to run out in the middle of October. Miserable, drenched, and starving scores of men turned back at this point, while others fell sick and were left for dead. By the time Arnold's tired expedition reached the St. Lawrence River on the 9th of November, they numbered 675 men, the rest having deserted, died, or been abandoned along the way. Arnold's men finally came to a halt at Pointe aux Trembles, some 20 miles from Quebec City, where they were joined in early December by Montgomery and his comparatively cheery troops. In the weeks that elapsed between the fall of Montreal and the joining of Montgomery's and Arnold's forces at Pointe aux Trembles, General Guy Carleton had been preparing Quebec City for a siege. Carleton had 1,800 men in his garrison, a force that historian Robert Middlecoff describes as a strange mixture of militia, Scottish soldiers, a handful of Marines, and large numbers of sailors drawn from ships in the harbour. Quebec itself was centred around Cape Diamond, located in the confluence between the St. Lawrence River and its tributary, the St. Charles. It took Montgomery 3 hours to get his men into position, and it was not until 2 a.m. on the 31st of December that they began to move. His troops wavered and then broke beneath the British volleys, the survivors fleeing back into the dark of the storm. To the north, Arnold's men were also discovered and were greeted by several volleys from the British muskets. Though the Americans could not effectively return fire due to the height of the wall, they held their ground and eventually managed to breach the wall. Arnold was wounded in the leg, leaving Daniel Morgan to take command as the Americans streamed into Lower Town. Morgan's men fought valiantly, but soon became confused when there was no sign of Montgomery or his men. The revelation that Montgomery had been defeated caused Morgan's men to panic, which Carleton was quick to take advantage of. The British counterattacked and engaged the Americans in street-to-street fighting. By 9 a.m., the battle was done. Over 400 Americans had been captured, including Morgan, with an additional 80 having been killed or wounded. The British suffered only 19 casualties. The plan was to attack Lower Town, where the British defences were believed to be weak. Arnold would lead 600 men against the northern side of Lower Town, while Montgomery led 300 men against the southern side. Montgomery's men fired rockets into the air to let Arnold's troops know that it was time to advance. But with visibility low, both groups soon became disorientated and confused in the blinding snow. Montgomery's men finally approached the walls of Quebec at around 5 a.m. but the British sentries spied the bobbing light emanating from the Americans' lanterns. The alarm was raised, and the British opened fire once Montgomery's troops were within close range. At the bottom of Cape Diamond rested the part of the city known as Lower Town, which was defended by hastily constructed palisades and a blockhouse. The main part of the city, called Upper Town, was protected on 3 sides by steep cliffs, and on the west side by a 30-foot wall that overlooked the Plains of Abraham. Montgomery, Arnold, and their combined 1,200 men surrounded the city and, on the 6th of December, began to lay siege. They sent a letter to Carleton demanding his surrender, but the British commander refused. Burning the letter without reading it, Carleton knew that time was on his side. He only had to hold out until spring, when the ice of the St. Lawrence would thaw, allowing British reinforcements to sail up the river to his aid. Additionally, the enlistment contracts of most of the miserable and starving American troops were set to expire at the end of the year, and it was becoming increasingly clear that most of them were not about to re-enlist. Montgomery realized that he had to take the city before the new year, and decided that his best chance was to wait until a snowstorm, when he could approach Quebec and scale the walls undetected, taking the garrison by surprise. On the 27th of December, Montgomery got the blizzard he had been waiting for, but by the time he got his men into position, the storm had subsided, and he was forced to call off the assault. He would get another chance on the night of the 30th of December, when another heavy blizzard, even worse than the last, struck Quebec. General Montgomery was killed almost instantly, his body shredded by grape shot fired from a British cannon. Despite the Americans' humiliating defeat, Arnold was not ready to give up quite yet. He pulled back about a mile from Quebec to regroup and wait, as reinforcements began to filter in from the colonies. Before long, he encircled Quebec City and once again began to lay siege. But Carleton had taken advantage of the lull by procuring more supplies and could now hold out for months. The condition of Arnold's wound worsened, forcing him to give up his command and return to Montreal, where he was replaced by General David Woos. The siege continued with relatively little development until Carleton's attempt to break the siege was squandered at the minor Battle of By this point, the Continental Congress had dispatched thousands of reinforcements to Quebec, including the experienced Major General John Thomas, who assumed overall command. However, the American army was soon ravaged by smallpox, which incapacitated a large portion of the soldiers, of whom many eventually died, including General Thomas himself. Additionally, discontent was festering in American-occupied Montreal. During his administration of the city, General Wooster had made many enemies by jailing suspected loyalists and forcing several communities to surrender their arms. The Canadians also came to despise the American troops, who paid for services with their own paper money rather than in hard British currency. In April 1776, a delegation from the Continental Congress arrived to assess public opinion in Canada. The delegation, which included Benjamin Franklin, found the population to be largely disposed against the Americans. Since the whole point of the invasion had been to whip up Canadian support for the American Revolution, this was a troubling discovery. The final nail in the coffin came in late May, when British General John Burgoyne arrived in Canada with thousands of fresh troops that included Hessian auxiliaries, mercenaries from the German principalities of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse. The arrival of these fresh forces encouraged Carleton to launch a counter-offensive, and he defeated the Americans at the Battle of Trois Rivières, taking many of them prisoner. The remnants of the American army withdrew back down the Richelieu River toward, while Arnold oversaw the evacuation of Montreal. By July 1776, the Americans had left Canadian soil, ending their invasion in failure. The American invasion of Quebec was the first major defeat that the Americans suffered in the Revolutionary War. It was a disastrous initiative that cost them many lives, including those of Richard Montgomery and John Thomas, two of their best commanders. It also ended all hope that that the province of Quebec might join the war on the American side, as it affixed Canada squarely in the arms of the British. One immediate consequence of the campaign's failure was that it positioned General Burgoyne and his British army to begin the Saratoga campaign the following year, in which he would move down from Canada and into New York's Hudson River Valley. This would be one of the most decisive campaigns in the war, culminating in the battles of Saratoga